Revenge and Roadkill, a tale of unexpected love. When I was a sophomore in high school, a new guy moved to town, Matt. Matt played guitar and I was a singer. Our love was meant to be. We started dating when I was a junior and he was a senior. I was 16, he was 17. Honestly, it was a super cute romance that would probably make a decent Wattpad story, but it wasn't meant to last as I was moving to a new state at the start of my senior year. This story takes place about 2 weeks before the end of my junior year, and the school and town are getting ready for senior graduation. The characters, not real names, OP, me, girlfriend Matt, boyfriend Griffin, bad friend Henry, good friend SDP, super dead possum, jumping right in. Matt was my first everything. Losing my virginity wasn't great, but is it ever? For everyone's sake, I hope that I'm wrong. Matt and I were awkward, but managed to talk boundaries before anything happened. In this conversation, we agreed that it was really important to both of us that this stayed private, absolutely no bragging or being weird around friends. Griffin was a senior and someone who was in our group of friends but not a close friend. We were all in either orchestra, choir, and/or band. Everyone in those programs ran in the same social circle. Griffin was a Christian, and it was a big part of his identity while we were at school. He had this, charisma or something. He used to invite classmates to his church while gently shaming all of us for not being exactly like him. Even though he was a bummer, his whatever charisma kept him active in the social scene, and he was at all of the major hangouts I can remember during that time. I was friendly with Griffin because, to put it simply, I lacked confidence. I grew up in a church where I was taught that men were more important than me, to never question a man. My own mother shamed me for wearing my volleyball uniform at home because it was inappropriate and could confuse my brother. Fucked up doesn't begin to cover that church, or the amount I had to unlearn. By the time I was 17, I was fully done with church, but still struggled with all I had been taught. It was a confusing time. Griffin knew this, and his self-assigned senior project was getting me back to church. I'm 99% sure it was only about getting Matt involved, because Griffin also wanted Matt to be a Christian, but had so far been massively unsuccessful. Matt was not a Christian, and had zero desire to know more. He saw firsthand how the church treated me and my family after some shit happened that was out of our control. Matt was not a fan. I kept a journal during that time in my life because if I didn't, I'm sure I would have done something terrible to myself. My journal was plain, nothing on it to draw attention because I never wanted my family to think it was a journal. It was supposed to look like a school notebook. One day during lunch, I was at my usual table where Griffin sat. I realized I needed something from the choir room, so I left my stuff at the lunch table, not thinking anything about leaving my backpack there. I had no idea anyone would go through my stuff because that had never happened before, and I didn't have anything of value in there anyway. Well, as it turns out, my journal ends up being valuable because I had written about Matt and I. Griffin thought he had the ammunition to get me back into church, and I'm assuming Matt was supposed to join us. Griffin proceeded to take my journal and tell basically everyone in our social group, which led to most of the school knowing. A private moment became everyone's, and it was fucking humiliating. Thankfully, Matt didn't blame me, even though I felt like it was all my fault. He was more confident than I was, but also didn't get nearly the same shame thrown his way that I was getting. I knew I was leaving in a few months, so I tried to keep my head down and focus on school, but being called a whore, slut, etc. by people I grew up with, it grates on you after a while. I guess Griffin's plan was to shame me back to church, but instead all I wanted before leaving town was to ruin Griffin. It took some time, but I got there. Matt, Henry, and I were hanging out at my house after school. My house backed up to a street that often had roadkill, due to being right alongside a huge swath of woods. At this point, I knew that my revenge was going to include Griffin's brand new truck. This truck was literally all he could talk about because it was custom. His parents got it for him as an early graduation present. It was super expensive. It was perfect. Bottom line is he loved that truck more than anything he had ever had. I'm not a car person, so I have no idea what the truck was, or if it was good, but I do know it was really, really tall. You couldn't see the top of it, which ended up being bad for Griffin, but fantastic for revenge. There was a big, super dead possum on the road behind my house that had been there for what seemed like a week, but I don't remember how many days exactly. Normally, the town was good about sending the guy down our road to pick up Roadkill, so it had been there long enough for me to notice it, which didn't happen often. I was staring at the SDP because, well, it was there. I'm staring. Matt starts staring. Then Henry starts staring. We start talking about Griffin while we're all staring at this disgusting pile. We're talking, and I'm getting mad, madder, then livid. However, I calm down when I realize we have an amazing opportunity in front of us. Gentlemen, we're going to bag that SDP and put it in Griffin's truck. This wouldn't be quite that simple, so we start brainstorming how we can fully get away with this. Griffin lived in the area of town where it was faster for him to walk to school instead of drive. Shortcut through the woods to the school meant a 3 minutes walk. Driving to school meant that he had to go 20 miles per hour, or slower, and one of the cops was always out. Because of how the schools were placed, so no speeding. Still took barely any time, but it was a longer route than the shortcut. Griffin, of course, drove to school. We had a plan. I snuck out that night, met Matt and Henry wearing all black and a mask, bagged up the SDP, the most disgusting thing I've ever done, and drove to Griffin's. We parked a bit away and went through the woods to the back of Griffin's house, lugging this bag of putrid nonsense. This was before the time where a lot of people had cameras on their property, so we didn't have to worry about anything besides floodlights on the side of the house. We had decided to put the SDP on top of the truck, knowing that Griffin wouldn't be able to see it, couldn't drive like an asshole, and wouldn't be taking his truck anywhere besides school. So, that SDP was fucking bloated, and if any of you are at all familiar with bloated roadkill, you may know where this is going. SDP was heavy and not going anywhere until this revenge was done. The next day at school, Griffin parks in the student lot like normal. We go to class like normal. I get called a few names throughout the day, and everyone is normal. I went through that day gleefully awaiting the final bell, knowing Griffin was in for a nasty surprise. This is happening 2 weeks before graduation in a very southern state. It was hot as fuck where I grew up with 90% humidity on top of it. So, the bloated SDP on top of Griffin's car? That SDP did what an old bloated SDP is going to do, which is explode. If you've never experienced this smell, I hope you never do. The final bell rang. Matt, Henry, and I strategically placed ourselves a bit behind Griffin so we could see him once he got to his truck. When you made it to the parking lot, you made it to the smell. It was so horrible. People were gagging, frantically looking around trying to find the source while covering their noses and sprinting to their cars. I knew this plan was going to satisfy my revenge, but never imagined this level of chaos. Griffin gets to his car, and because the SDP exploded, he definitely notices it now. Also, his windows were cracked, and all the ahem juice ahem seeped into the roof, down the windows, and the inside siding of the doors. There was no way he was driving home, so he had to call a tow. Griffin started vomiting because he had stood too close to his truck for too long. Matt, Henry, and I were in the music programs, and often stayed late, so we stuck around for this whole fiasco, no one noticing us, and we get to see everything. Griffin manages to get on the phone, calling his parents crying that his truck had been destroyed, and we could hear his dad yelling from the speaker. Eventually the tow arrives, the guy gagging but gets the truck loaded up and out of the parking lot. At this point, Griffin had been yelling/crying/vomiting about his truck, long enough that the people left at school knew what had happened, and by the following morning, everyone knew. When Griffin came into school the next day, his parents and a guy in a suit were with him. A lot of people knew Matt and I had issues with Griffin. Matt was called to the principal's office, but never me. I'll never know the exact reason for this, but it is most likely a combination of not having any physical evidence against Matt or myself, and that no one imagined a woman would be involved in a retaliation scheme so disgusting. Griffin, his parents, and guy in suit tried to throw weight around to get some type of punishment for what happened, but there wasn't really anything the school could do to appease them without knowing who did it or having evidence that it happened at school. There were cameras at the school, and it was clear that Griffin arrived at school with the SDP already on his car. Everyone totally knew that Griffin's car was destroyed by Matt, and probably me, but never Henry. No reason to suspect Henry. With no proof, though, no one could actually say anything. After that day, people stopped calling me names, and I was mostly ignored until I moved away. If people did have to talk to me, they were polite and to the point. I was told years later that people were genuinely terrified of Matt, and I because plenty of shit had been said, so everyone thought they were going to be next. The SDP was very effective. Pretty sure Griffin's truck ended up entirely unusable, but I don't know what they did with it. I only know that they spent a lot of time and a decent amount of money trying to get the smell out with no luck. Wouldn't be surprised if every car detailing service within 100 miles was used. Griffin didn't speak to Matt or me for the reminder of my time in that town. He stopped sitting with us, stopped going to events that we were at, and never invited us to church again. I was only around through the middle of summer, but it was long enough to witness a noticeable difference in Griffin's behavior. The graduation ceremony arrived, and being a year younger, I was in the crowd cheering for my friends. This was completely unplanned, but I get giddy picturing his face decades later. I managed to make eye contact with Griffin after he was done walking across the stage, and quickly made an explosion motion with my hands and winked. He knew exactly what I meant. The only true drop the mic and I'm out I've ever had.